Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode 20, and Crimson Vow takes a bow. It's the end of the format, and I decided to use this episode to think about how do formats evolve in their time. How does the card evaluation, deck building changes over time? And we're going to look at a bit about changes in card power, a bit of types of change that we will experience during the duration of the format, and a bit of a change in card perception and changes in availability of cards is going to be the main focus of the talk today. So, but as always, I will start with a preamble that is somehow always linked to the topic. This is my soapbox moment when I can talk about how the cards change. So the preamble for today is a card on day one of the format is very different from the same card on the last day of the format. And this has to do with many things. Like, first of all, cards are not evaluated correctly in the beginning. People pick them either too high or too low, and we're going to try to look at some examples of that. But also, the decks don't look the same. Decks on day one are usually a razzmatazz of random things, and we're trying things, and we're testing, and we're experimenting. There is also like a bunch of players that only play in the first couple of days of the format, maybe to get some cards, maybe to, get the feel of the limited format online. And then they don't continue playing as the format progresses. Then it's left, to the grindier, more invested players to play limited. And because of those things, because of the updates in the card evaluation, updates in the deck building process, updates in the synergy, day one of the format and the last day are completely different animals, and you should think about them like that. And you should maybe. So, the goal of today's seminar is basically to try to look at the ways that you can put yourself slightly ahead of the curve as the format evolves, because we know more or less how the formats evolve right now, but because we have the data to look like how long does it take for people to come to the consensus version of the metagame. And when you know those dates and when you know the durations of those times, it's actually quite beneficial for you, because you can actually know, look, I know that card evaluation is not going to change anymore that much. This is the moment when I have to start positioning myself in the card metagame. This is the moment when I have to look at the best synergies and stuff like that. So it's like I very rarely address older things from Magic's history in terms of in terms of theoretical work and punditry, and it's bad. And I thought today I'll give you a couple of examples of people that dealt with the evolution of the limited format before. One was half joking. Paul Ritzel said that the format evolves like this: that week 1, 2, it's the best format ever. Week 3, it's tempo dominated. Week 4, bomb dependent. And week 5, it's unplayable. Now, this is not exactly how the formats evolve over time. This is his joking impression of what people say about the format. But there is a bit of truth in there, in terms that this week 1 and 2 seems to be very important for the development of the format, and it looks very differently from any other stage of the format. Um, I don't agree that at week 5 the format becomes unplayable, because we still do play it, but we also see that there's a drop off of how many people play. And usually, at week 7 to 10, only the toughest of the MTG grinders stay in the limited area, which makes it also being drafted differently, because if the fraction of the very invested players is higher, the draft experience is becoming severely different. But there is a more serious approach on stages of limited format from Neil Olver from, 6 years ago and a bit, when he discusses the two stages of draft format. So basically, what he says is that there comes a time in the format when everyone understands the baseline decks and has a general understanding of which cards are good and which are bad. This is stage 1 of the draft format. And then today I'll talk about stage 2, in which you use format knowledge as a tool to attack the metagame. And I think that this is a very good description. The problem I have with it is that there clearly is the format when everyone doesn't understand the baseline decks and has no general understanding of which cards are good and which are bad. And I think that this is a pretty important stage because most drafts are played in that stage. The density of drafting in those early stages is much higher than the density of drafting in stage 1 and 2. So, for the needs of this particular stream, I decided to introduce additional stage 0. And stage 0 is the discovery stage. This is the stage when we don't know what we're doing, we're trying things, we're basing a lot of things. Sorry. Some water. We base a lot of things on fundamentals and maybe prior knowledge, and maybe um, on what we think about the format when we analyzed them before it was released, if you are into this kind of thing like I am, clearly. So we're going to talk about basically stage 0, discovery, stage 1, establishment of the metagame, stage 2, the stage where you can actually attack the metagame and try to figure out something on your own based on your experiences, and find a way to navigate through the metagame and gain advantage over people that you're playing. As I said, how I describe the stages is one. Stage 0 is reaching the consensus of card priorities. And we're going to see that in data that this stage can be pretty easily defined. Stage 2 is the stable card metagame does exist, but it just was established, so there is no time yet to properly attack it because you still need to get the format specific knowledge and start applying it. Once you have it in your like little finger, then you can actually start solving the format stage, which is stage 2. And this is the graph of white commons in Crimson Vow in terms of their average last seen as metric. That basically means how late or early do you see the card on average in a booster pack during the draft. And the top cards, top commons, are around between 3 and 4. So you will see them on average between pick 3 and 4. These are the top commons. And the bottom ones are under 8. So you will see them on average, around the wheel. So they will wheel quite reliably and you will see them quite reliably. And from this data, you can see that it is the early part of the format, just before the set was released on the 11th of November, roughly to maybe 25th of November or something, when you see any cards that are changing. What you can also see is that not that many cards do change dramatically during that time. The biggest shift over the time of the format was a Traveling Minister, which started to be picked at around 6, and it was the ninth most popular common in white. And after around 3 weeks, it reached number 2, and it has risen from being seen average on 6 to being seen on average at 4. So that's 2 picks basically difference over the first 3 weeks. But also you can see that after this 3-week period, it sort of stabilizes, and the cards don't change much in evaluation over that time. So they will be available more or less the same on average. Now, of course, average in drafts with humans is a very broad term because you will have some drafts when one color pair is wide open and some where you can't pick anything out of it, and you will have to still navigate through the draft using your skills and then evaluation of what is open and was not. But generally, you will know that after week 3, even after week 2, in case of most cards, I mean, Traveling Minister was a bit of a slow riser there, you will have a more or less stable metagame. So because of that, I divided the stage 0 as the first 3 weeks, stage 1 as a couple of weeks in between when people start figuring out that the metagame already has stabilized. But if you know you can look at those graphs for every color, every rarity, and every set that was there on 17 lands, and you can establish that actually most formats are stable after 2 weeks. And basically you can start playing, start figuring the format in the first 2 weeks, and then at 2 weeks you look at the alsas and you sort of can figure out, okay, that's going to be the order until the end of the format. Now is the time for me to start attacking this metagame. But normally there is this stage when people still don't know. They still have like old information. So they're like, oh, well, Traveling Minister was wheeling quite a lot in the beginning because they played a lot of drafts in the first 4 days. They might have missed this increase and they based on the old information. And because of that, it takes some time for them to go from this stage 0 to stage 2. And this is this intermediate part. Now, if you know what are the dynamics of the card evaluation in big populations and that it's quite stable after those 2-3 weeks, then you can actually start looking to go to stage 2, the stage where you try to play against the meta game quite early. And this is one of the edges that you can get from looking at the data, knowing at which stage does the average picks of people plateau and don't change much until the end of the format. So I decided to put a couple of things about each stage, just for a good start of the presentation, just to maybe speculate about what's going on in each stage and why they are different from each other. And I'll start it with stage 0. And I think that the biggest advantage in the stage 0 is knowing individual card power. Knowing which cards are much better than the others, knowing which cards are overperforming very early is going to be a thing that will make you win quite a lot. And I think that this is the best time for invested players in terms of how much they play, how much content they consume. Because if you consume content, you've seen your set reviews, you've seen the first week impressions from many streamers, you will know which cards are sort of like hidden gems that you can pick. And this is the time when people slowly catch up on them and start drafting them higher and higher and higher because they see them on the other side of the battlefield. And but if you're there early, then you can force some decks, and that's been the case in Midnight Hunt with the blue black, and that's been the case with the black red in AFR. There were several decks that were and in part black red also in Crimson Vow. It was much better early because people were not drafting very powerful card as early as they probably should have, because they still didn't know their power. Like several cards were there, and we're going to talk about them a bit. But this advantage slowly erodes during that stage 0 because the pick orders of people are getting updated. Not of all of them. There will be always players that have completely different pick orders because they draft occasionally, they don't know which cards are most powerful, and you will still, sometimes end up in a draft that drafts like a stage 0 draft, but you're 6 weeks into the format. But on average, this advantage from the early days slowly erodes. And one of the most important things that I think is worth noting in the stage 0 part of the format is that this is the stage where power counts for much more than synergy, because trying to maximize all those little synergies between cards takes time, because it takes repetition, because it takes time finding them, it takes time making sure that you understand exactly how they work, and then starting applying those plans in your decks. And it also takes time to play them well. You can have synergistic cards in your deck, but if you don't play them well together, you don't gain any advantage of those existing synergies, because synergy existing doesn't mean that the synergy is used appropriately. And this is I think that these are the 4 main characteristics of this stage 0 when we are still discovering how the decks work, how the cards work, and how everything works in the format. And yeah, again, as I said, this is the time for a deep grind if you're a super invested player and you know things that other people have to still discover in those 2 weeks. If you know them from day one, you're going to go quite far in terms of your win rate over the first week, because you can abuse that lack of knowledge on the other side. Stage 1. I think that the biggest advantage of stage 1 is having a plan for the deck. So right now we're entering the stage where pick orders sort of stalled, but are not completely stationary yet. So it's the best time when you figured out the plan for particular decks. You can actually use that to your advantage, because people are still maybe relying on the card power and maybe still learning on the card power of the cards in their deck. Well, you might be one step ahead because you have a plan, and that plan will involve some amount of synergy. So you will know that, okay, card A, card B, card C, they work well together because they lead to the same goal. This particular signpost uncommon is amazing because if you put this common that is underpicked, it can work fantastically. And this is the moment when innovation becomes promoted. It's basically, or watching innovation, because you can still consume innovation. But this is the moment when you sort of, if you come with good plans because you already know that which cards are verified good and verified bad, you can sort of come up with the consistent plans for some decks. You can start having preferences in the format, not based on what's open, but based on what works well together. And I think that this is the stage when power becomes. I mean, obviously, power is always important in your limited deck, but I think that this is the moment when synergy becomes more prominent. So you will find that some archetypes that are power based from start are going to be very good in the early season. Um, but some archetypes that take longer time to figure out because you need to have exactly the combination of particular cards are going to start blooming in this later stage of the season. So synergy becomes more important, and understanding synergies gives you a bit bigger edge. Okay, stage two. Biggest advantage that you can have in the stage two is finding holes in the metagame. So we know that after those 2-3 weeks, the pick orders are sort of stable, and you have to keep in mind again that there is a big variance when you will see the cards depending on the draft put that you're on, and that's going to be definitely something to look for. But you know that average pick orders are sort of stable. Because you know that they're stable, you can start finding holes in the metagame. Like, you can start thinking about the plans that involve cards that are low on this pick order, because you can expect that those cards will still be low on that pick order in 6 weeks. So that's a long-term planning that will give you some sort of advantage over other people. This is the moment when drafting open cohesive plan is more important than drafting powerful but overdrafted color pairs. And stress points here are open because we will know what is more open than the other colors, and stress is on the cohesive. So you sort of combine the things from stage zero. In stage zero, we focus on what's more open, and stage one, when a cohesive plan was being important, and you combine those two because you know the numbers for both of those things. And that's going to be stronger than drafting powerful but overdrafted color pairs. Like, if you have the memory that black red was the most powerful color pair in Crimson Vow in the first couple of weeks, and you try to force those black and red, well, people went much higher on black and red, and it's less open, and you're not going to be very successful with that strategy. So basically, you're promoted from knowing the metagame and knowing what is open. And I'm using data for that because that's the kind of a person I am. Uh, but lots of people that draft a lot will just find it out based on their personal experience. And it's also not wrong. Personal experience is quite a good thing, especially that your personal experience is going to be already driving this cohesive plan part of the things. So if you have a good sense of what is open as well, and it fits your cohesive plan, then you can start having preferences and starting drafted with preferences. And because of that, in that stage, synergy becomes even more important. And again, I would say relatively, not absolutely, because in some formats will be more power driven, some formats will be more synergy driven. But even in power driven formats, there will be some element of synergy that will be increasing over time because people learn how to build their decks better and learn how to draft cards for their decks better. Because if you have a choice between 3 cards in pack 3, pick 4, let's say, you might pick something different on stage 0 when you're just learning the format, and you'll pick something different in stage 2 when you know the format in and out. So basically, probably your pick in stage 2 is going to be more driven by synergy with all the other cards in your deck and the potential cards that your deck might get. So basically, across the gradient of those stages, synergy becomes more and more important. Okay, so now we can jump into a bit of data from Crimson Vow. And for the needs of this analysis, I defined stage 0 as week 1 and 2 of the format, so 14 days. Stage 1 is weeks 3 to 6, so 4 weeks. And stage 2 is weeks 7 to 10. And God, I can't believe that it's already 10 weeks of Crimson Vow that we've been drafting, but Christmas break in between maybe helped to lessen the blow. But basically, we have 10 weeks, and it's 2, 4, and 4 for stages 0, 1, and 2, respectively. So first, I wanted to maybe talk a bit about individual card evaluation changes. And I started with the cards that went lower in people's opinion, and I sorted them for difference between stage 0 and stage 1. So basically, when you look at those graphs, the card that changed the most in the first 2 weeks was Skulking Killer, which dropped by average of 0.8 picks in people's preferences over those first 2 weeks. And then in stage 2, it dropped by a further 0.1. So there's no big change between stage 1 and stage 2, but there's quite a big change between stage 1 and stage 2 and stage 1 and stage 3. So yeah, and we can see that I only put top 10 cards that changed the most during the between stage 1 and stage 2, and we have Skulking Killer, we have Graph Reaver, the 3/3 exploit guy that can kill potentially planeswalkers, or never. This one dropped down. Patchwork Crawler, that's another blue rare. That's a blue rare that is a 1/2 that can get some abilities from creature cards in the graveyard when you exile them. There's the Honeymoon Hearse, the 3 mana 5/5 vehicle that you need 2 creatures to tap and make it into a creature. There's the Consuming Tide, the sort of like a poor man's upheaval that doesn't bounce the most valuable thing from the opponent. Boarded Window, an artifact that gives -1/-0 to opponent's creatures, but if you get damage for 4, well, there goes the Boarded Window, through the window. Bloodsworn Squire, one of the uncommon vampires. Alchemist's Gambit, the Time Walk variant in red that makes you lose the game if you don't pay the cleave cost. Splendid Reclamation, that's the get lands from graveyard back on the battlefield. I assume it's a constructed card of some sort. And weirdly, Stormcard Coast, which is the land. But what you can see from those cards is that there is not a single common among them. So basically what happened here is that people started evaluating rares and uncommons less. And all of those cards are relatively poor in terms of their win rate, maybe with the noted exception of Alchemist Gambit, who was actually not a terrible card in the end of the season when people learned which deck wants them and how to use them. But the important part is that, first of all, changes are not dramatic. It's like even the difference between stage 0, so the first 2 weeks, and stage 2 is around 1 pick. So basically, if you saw it average as pick 6, you will now see it on average as pick 7. This is not a massive change in terms of card evaluation, but it still leads to people sensing intuitively that some colors are being more open and some colors are not. But yeah, as I said, the very important part of that finding, and you will have to go quite further down that list to find the first common. Very important finding from this one is that people don't evaluate commons down. If a common was poor, probably they figured that out very, very, very early. Now, we don't see the same thing when it comes to the cards that went up in evaluation, which ironically on the graphs I'm presenting looks down, but these are the cards that gained most attention from people. So basically, the most improved common between the weeks 1, 2 and the weeks 3, 6 was Traveling Minister and Falconrat Celebrant. They gained a whole pick across those first 2 weeks. Then we have Voldaren Epicure, Ceremonial Knife, Cassic Flame Breather, Reckless Impulse, Blood Fountain, Diagraph Scavenger, Ancestral Anger, and Ballista Watcher. Now, here we see a completely different pattern. It's basically only commons and maybe Ballista Watcher that were underestimated in the first weeks. Now, this also, of course, has a slight mathematical reason. It's just commons are going to be picked later, so they have a much bigger possibility of being evaluated highly, while rares are usually picked within the first, first 2-3 picks, even the poor rares. So there is very little space for them to go up. Yes, if you look at the whole period of from stage 0 to stage 2, Cassic Flame Breather was the most improved in terms of being picked at 1.34. Traveling Minister very close, but by 1.31. So, I mean, basically 1.33 of a pick up in people's evaluation on average. And I'm sure that there were people that were high on Cassic Flame Breather from the beginning, and there were people that were high on Traveling Minister. I raise my hand here. From the beginning, but not everyone was, and the group that was not high on this card evaluated higher over the duration of the format. Right. So this is how people evaluated cards and how this evaluation changed. But then you have to keep in mind that all the other 257 cards in the format sort of oscillated between change of 0.6 and drop of or in the 0.5. So being picked 0.6 picks later or 0.5 picks earlier across the format. And most of them are almost unchanged over the duration of the format. Basically, just the daily noise that you can measure. And if you can take several weeks of data, you don't see anything in there. So as I said, there are no big differences between stage 1 and stage 2 in the commons. Even the two real notable exceptions are Ancestral Anger, that was picked much higher between the stage 1 and stage 2, and Cassic Flame Breather, that was picked much higher between stage 1 and stage 2. So basically, these two cards, Ancestral Anger, Cassic Flame Breather, are the sort of late discovery in the format, because both of them were picked more aggressively in this later format than in the middle format. And probably, it's not an accident that two of those cards that work so well together were picked on at exactly the same time. Okay, I think that's my cat falling down the stairs or something. So the other part I want to look at was the change in win rates across the stages by each archetype. And I have a graph here with every single archetype present. Yeah, my cat is going mad upstairs. That's an interesting introduction. Well, oh God, I lost the word. Interruption. Yeah, he's just running over me. Interesting. Okay, but ignoring my cat, which should be always done. If you look at the archetypes that improved over time quite reliably, we see that white-green started pretty low. It started actually as the lowest archetype in the week 1. But at stage 2, it's actually quite playable. It's not in the top 5, but it definitely overtook several other archetypes, and it has a pretty, acceptable win rate of 56%, jumping from 53 in the first couple of weeks. other archetype that improved over the duration of the format, white blue. It started sort of middling, fourth, fifth place of after the first week with around 56% win rate, and it jumped up to 58, becoming the most winning archetype at in the stage two. And the same can be said for white black, which also started at 55 and then improved to 56 in stage one and 58% in stage two. So these are the biggest improvers, jumping from somewhere in the middle of the pack to two top positions in the archetype win rate thing. Now, other story is black red, which was definitely the highest win rate archetype in the first 2 weeks. Then it dropped off slightly. I mean, still staying within that 57% range, but probably like 0.3%, whatever lower. And then bounced back to more or less the level from the beginning of the format. But I mean, this archetype did not improve over time. It just more or less stayed in the same place while other people moved, while other archetypes moved a bit up. And the same with the red green, which red green also had the slump in the middle of the format when people maybe started forcing it because they heard that, oh, black red and red green are quite good. And then it bounced back at the end to more or less the same level as it was in the beginning. Another interesting pair of archetypes is black green, which stayed sort of stable over the first 6 weeks at 53, 54 percent. And then it sort of bounced up to 55% over the last 2 weeks. And the same pattern you can see from blue black, only in this case it's from 54 to 56. And actually from being very average into being pretty decent. So I think that late format blue black people figured out how to draft it better, and the cards became slightly more open because people finally weaned off the blue black. Okay, Zach Kagan is asking what's going on with the blue green. I think that so blue green had really bad beginning, so it was like on par with the white green as two worst archetypes in the beginning. Then it, well, I wouldn't say skyrocketed, but it went up by 2 percentage points in terms of win rate. Um, and But then you had this weaning off, and I think that this had to do at least in part something with Sam Black and his drafting archetypes episode when he basically laid out a good version of blue green and people started drafting it. So it was one of the first decks that get this super synergistic kind of build. But then other decks got even more synergistic builds, and the power level was not there in the blue green, and there was a slight drop off there, probably. And you also can see that blue red increased stably through the format, but the change between week two and stage one and stage two is not massive, but there is still some increase there, so probably not significant, but there is some increase. And interesting part of that is that that increase happened even though you had lower access to those Keswick flame breathers and ancestral angers in the second stage. I mean, I'm not saying that that this is definitely the impact of Sam Black, but I think that him outlining the blue black archetype so early and so succinctly was definitely playing a role of more people trying to draft it and drafting it in a better way. And you have to keep in mind that blue green was very rarely drafted. So even small changes in people drafting it properly would be resulting in quite large differences. Keep in mind, blue green was drafted maybe like 3.5% of the time of all the archetypes. So by the 17 lens users. So it was very rarely drafted. Like compared with the black red, which was drafted 17% of the time. So it was like 6 times less drafted than or 5 times less drafted than black red. Okay, so here we are. Right. Now we reach the topic of the openness of the color. And by openness of the color, if you listen to one of my previous episodes, I looked at how to openness. Nice typo in there, and also lacking a bracket on the slide, but that doesn't matter. In the episode when I talked about drafting with bots, I looked at the number of cards you will see in a pod for each archetype that have a win rate of over 55% game in hand in that archetype. And I did the same thing for human drafts here, just to see if there is a link between the openness of the archetype win rate. Now, the problem with that measure, and I want to stress it very, very strongly in the beginning, is that it's at least partially a circular argument, because obviously if the win rate of the archetype improves, there will be more cards that have over 55% game in hand win rate. I think that I still need to work on that particular metric, but I only had time to do this one, so I'm going to do this one. There's still some interesting observations that you can actually come up with from it, but probably next time, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to make a dynamic win rate cutoff range, when the win rate cutoff range will be probably like 1 percentage point over the average win rate for the archetype in that particular time frame. Because then we can actually measure how many good cards you open, you see for each archetype, and it's probably more comparable. But didn't do it this time. Lessons learned. I figured it out when I was deeply invested, and the seminar had to start in half an hour, so I couldn't change that. It's still, nonetheless, even with that circularity and the argumentation, there is some things that you can actually um, observe from it. So, first thing, you see that at stage two archetypes in particular were super open, and that's white black and white blue. Probably dealing something to do with how open white was, um, and how well those synergies were discovered and applied, and because of that, how good the decks work together. But these were definitely, like, you could see on average 53, 56 good cards for the white black and white blue in a pod. Obviously, some of them will be in the same pack, so that doesn't mean that you can draft 56 cards, because you anyway draft 42 of them. But it means that almost in every pack you would see a card that would fit in your deck, which means you're open enough that you can basically design the deck around what your plan is. And this um, this thing basically is related with the win rates, because these were the two most winning archetypes in this stage two metagame. And you also saw like a lot of open cards at blue red, a lot of open cards in blue black. And I told you that blue black increased in this last week, and you can see that you saw twice the amount of the good cards in blue black, possibly partially because it started winning more, but possibly also because it was slightly more open, and people figured out better builds. And for some archetypes, you see that black red was one of the most open color pairs in the first week. Still heavily contested compared to white blue in stage two. Black red got like 36 open cards that were 55% win rate or more in the first weeks, only losing out to blue red. But it seems to me that blue red was not there on the power level, because it was wide open in the first week but didn't have the win rate. So this one was clearly a synergistic archetype pair, while this one was clearly power driven. And okay, hopefully we can see it from this. I will put them side by side so we can look at the win rates of the archetypes and the openness of the colors. But you can see like blue white increases almost linearly in terms of openness and the win rate. White black, same kind of thing. Blue red, same kind of thing. So basically, if the openness increases at the same time as win rate, it probably means that the openness is driven by the win rate. So maybe you want to apply the second measure. That's what drove me to that conclusion. But in some cases, white red was way more open in the last stage, but didn't increase in the win rate, which means that this deck was purely um, this deck that probably had issues of going over a certain win rate, because if you have twice more good cards open in each draft on average, and you still don't improve your win rate, that means that probably this archetype has some sort of ceiling. It will win with some things, but it will almost always lose with the others. And no one figured out a good build because, again, it was not a very supported archetype. But yeah, in general, you see some dramatic changes in terms of openness. White green especially. It started with like maybe 3 cards per draft that you saw that were win rate over 55, and at the end of the format you see 28. And to me, this exactly is the measure where the deck was figured out over the time of the format, because probably the 2.8 cards with the win rate above 55% meant people couldn't make good decks out of white green. And over the time, they learned how to make good decks. They trimmed the cards that are not needed and bad, and they started putting only the cards that are good and useful and maybe going rarer on this archetype, and that pumped up the win rate by 3 percentage points, and that boosted the open cards in each draft pod on average from 2.8 to 28, so tenfold increase, which is something. Okay. Anything interesting here? Well, we see that we see the same trend in the black red and red green as we saw in the win rate. We see the same trend in the openness. So basically, why don't I have my laser pointer? Laser pointer is much better. So basically, you see this drop off after stage one, in stage one, and bounce back in stage two, and the same for the openness, and the same with red green basically. And what you also see that across the board, each archetype was more open in stage two, and this is one of the most important findings in this talk. That basically, independently of what you were drafting, you got a boost in how many cards you see for each archetype that are open. And the reason for that, if I would be to guess, is that there was a slight increase in the win rate in general over the course of the duration of the format, because only the most invested players stayed to play the game. But also because people stopped picking cards that are not for their deck. And therefore, if you were in red, green, and you wanted those 2/2 wolves, you were going to get them slightly more often, because people won't pick them unless they are in the red green. And if they picked them, you could probably more reliably assume that there is another red green drafter on the table and act accordingly to that observation. So basically, there were definitely plenty of commons in Crimson Vow that only fitted one of the 4 archetypes in its color pairs. And in the beginning, people were just like taking them all over the place. And I think that later in the format, it just basically changed. So signaling became more reliable, and good players can read signals quite well, especially when they are reliable. Average level of the players participating in drafts increased, which makes drafts are more predictable. And at the same time, people knew that how coherent their builds should be, and because of that, they started basically they started picking, they stopped picking the wrong cards for the wrong deck, basically. So you can see that, and I'm going to be quite interested to redo this analysis for the next expansion, this time hopefully using slightly more fancy methodology, where I can at least spend a couple of weeks playing around with the data before I go into it, because this is the problem with those analyses. No one ever done them. You don't know the methodology. If you have to discover a new method to week from week, it's you have some failure rate. And I think I wouldn't call this one particularly a failure because you can still find interesting things in there, but I would definitely do it slightly different next time, especially that the labor cost was not much higher to do it differently, but redoing it was well, that was doubling the work, and I didn't have time to that. Okay, so here I wanted to also compare the win rate to openness. So basically, with the idea that if it's linear, then we know that most likely the increase in the win rate is 100% responsible for the increase in the openness. But we see that in some colors it wasn't. And so basically, what I think about these that don't fit on that general trend line, these are the colors that were particularly power driven. And if something is below that line, they were particularly synergy driven. So if we see here, we have the couple of synergy driven archetypes that were well, not so that were more open probably than they should have been, or synergy less archetypes that were um, well, basically open and yet did not yield sufficient results. So basically they had a problem with the synergy in them. um, And at stage 3, you basically have almost a perfect linear correlation between the how open the color was and what the win rate was. So in the end, we sort of maximize the synergy, maximize the card power, and we get the win rates that are very, very strongly linked to how open colors are. And probably this is something to keep in mind when you play the next format, that you basically are going to have chaos for the first couple of weeks, maybe 4 weeks. And after that, you should really start looking at how many cards with high win rate you can get in each color pair, and at least try to, I'm not going to say force because you should never force in the human drafts, but at least have several of those color pairs ready in your mind when you start a draft, because you're more likely to see good cards in those colors on average. And then you can position yourself quite well in the metagame by basically ignoring the bottom 4 archetypes that are the least open, and gain another advantage over other people by, being well positioned and playing the metagame and knowing the metagame and understanding what is open and what's not. All right. Acknowledgements. As always, the data was provided by the 17 lands, and this time I actually exclusively used the data that is available on the website. I just took the different time ranges of each measure that I was looking at, the win rates, the color win rates, the average last seen as, which could lead me to calculating how open colors were, which basically is a bit of maths involved, but not too much. But still, of course, if the data is from the fancier data set or from the simpler data set, the team worked countless hours to get those data to us. So thanks to Viral Misnomer, Hululu, Grant Wu. Thanks to Fake Jake Brown, aka Uncle Cardboard, who is helping me with turning this thing into a podcast